plants. Woo! Oh my gosh, I've done a lot of these videos. I hope they are useful. Okay, so let's just make sure I'm recording. Check. Okay, so land plants. So remember that we have three domains of life: bacteria, archaea, the prokaryotes, and then we have eukaryotes. We've already spoken about protists and fungi, and now we're going into the plants. So what are plants' closest relatives? How did they evolve? And how do we see the major diversity? So what we're going to be talking about today is that plants came from algae. That's the ancestor of plants. And then we have four kinds. We have bryophytes, pterophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. It just shows a really nice evolution of these different kinds of plants onto land. It's a nice example of adaptations for colonization of land. So green algae, again, it's eukaryotic, multicellular. They do have complexes for making cellulose. They have a flagellated sperm, and they have a cell plate during cell division, a phragmoplast. But as we go from green algae to plants, we're going to see, again, eukaryotic still, multicellularity. They're photoautotrophs. We're going to see chlorophyll A and B and cell walls that have cellulose. So if you compare algae to plants, you can see that they have some different adaptations for land, such as roots, stems, cuticles, and leaves. Land plants are all photoautotrophs. They're primarily terrestrial. They live on land. They have different tissues, roots and shoots. They have sexual reproduction, and they are primarily diploid. They have stomata, a cuticle to prevent water loss, stomata on the bottom of leaves to take in and out gases. They have lignin, which forms the woody part of plants to get higher, to grow taller. And then they have reproduction that has changed to really be protective of the embryos. Plants have a very unique kind of reproduction called alternation of generations, where it alternates between the haploid gametophyte stage and the diploid sporophyte stage. Remember that the sporophytes give rise to spores, which are haploid. They make the gametophyte. The gametophyte gives rise to gametes, which fuse to become a sporophyte that's diploid. Four major groups: the bryophytes, which are have no vascular tissue, and by vascular tissue I mean xylem and phloem. Then we have the ferns, which are seedless, the gymnosperms, which are the pines, which do have seeds and pollen, and then we have angiosperms, which are the flowering and the fruiting. More angiosperms on Earth than any other type of plant. So I'm not going to go into the major details of all of these different groups, but I think it's most important to understand the adaptations. So for example, the bryophytes, which are the earliest, which are the earliest adaptation after algae, they rely primarily on diffusion. They have very strong ties to water. They have to live in moist environments. They're primarily haploid, and they have very primitive roots. As we go up into the seedless vascular plants, which are the pterophytes or the ferns, we see the adaptation for vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. Remember, xylem is going to bring water from the roots to the tips. Phloem goes in both directions to move the sugar created by photosynthesis all around. They have support to make them taller. They're primarily diploid, and they do have a flagellated sperm still, but they're less reliant on water, and they have real roots. Oh, nice, Gaga. The gymnosperms are the pines. These are the first seed plants, so we go finally away from spores and now into actual seeds. We also see the evolution of pollen. So instead of having a flagellated sperm, we have an airborne sperm in the form of pollen. We have very developed vascular tissue, and we have lots of ways of preventing water loss, such as cuticles, very small leaves, in the form of pine needles, etc. Their diploid is dominant. The diploid form is dominant, so when you see a tree outside, those are diploid. And the gametophyte, or the part of the plant that makes gametes, is become very microscopic. It's very, very small, right? And it has a more complex life cycle, but we do have two different kinds of cones. One, male cones for pollen, and female cones, which will contain the female egg or the mother cell. Angiosperms, this is a huge diversity. These have become very successful to occupy almost every ecological niche on Earth. They are the only plants that make flowers and fruits, and those are adaptations to protect the embryos. They have co-evolved with animal pollinators. They're diploid primarily, and they have a very reduced microscopic gamete. If you look at a life cycle of an angiosperm, again, we have pollen that will grow down into fertilize the egg, and then that egg, or that zygote, rather, once it's fertilized, is very protected within the fruit of a plant. All right, so we're going to go right into plant structure function. So remember that as plants evolved from algae, we had the development of shoots and roots. So increased photosynthesis with the shoots and the leaves and the stems, and roots, we got increased absorption of minerals and water from the environment. So here again we have the different types of land plants. Remember, it starts with bryophytes, so the mosses. Then we go to ferns, gymnosperms, and then the angiosperms. Angiosperms are either monocot or dicot. We are growing sunflowers right now, and they have just emerged from the soil, and they have two little leaves, so they are a dicot. I'm not going to test you this on my cumulative. There's three basic plant organs. We have stems, leaves, and roots. They're pretty self-explanatory. Stems, transportation system; leaves for photosynthesis; roots for anchoring and absorbing. There's three basic plant tissues. We have the dermal tissue, kind of like the skin of the plant. We have the vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, and then we have all of the other tissue, which is for metabolism. And remember, when we're talking about plant metabolism, they go through cellular respiration just like every other eukaryotic cell, right? So you get photosynthesis in the leaves that makes sugars. They get transported into this ground tissue. The ground tissue then has lots of mitochondria that will then help break down that glucose into energy for the plant. Plant growth is different than a lot of other growth of eukaryotic organisms because it is indeterminate, meaning trees at least can grow forever and ever and ever, whereas humans have kind of a max size. So we both have growth, meaning increase in mitosis, and development, meaning specialization of tissues, right? So plants, the way that they grow is through an embryonic-like tissue called meristem tissue. And you have different shoot apical meristem tissue and root apical meristem tissue. The most important thing is that this tissue has the ability, it's like stem cells, it just divides and divides and divides and divides. So you get a lot of mitosis in these regions that are then going to drive the shoots up and the roots down. You have in plants primary and secondary growth. So primary growth is increase in length, and secondary growth is the increase in thickness. So vascular tissue, again, xylem and phloem. The way I remember is that things flow down, and that's just how I remember that xylem is always up, 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 right? And xylem, you're bringing water up. Phloem is actually in both directions, food and water. So xylem, water and minerals from the roots to the shoots. Phloem, sugars from photosynthesis to the roots and the shoots. So there's two-way flow in the phloem, unlike xylem, which is a one-way path. Sugars get moved all around, right? So Again, photosynthesis occurs primarily in leaves, in that tissue. Why am I forgetting the name of the tissue where photosynthesis occurs? Bah! All right. Photosynthesis occurs in these in the leaves, in the mesophyll. There we go. In the mesophyll tissue, in the chloroplasts, and then you make sugar. That sugar can then move throughout the plant. Use cellular respiration in the mitochondria to break that sugar down into energy, ATP. So the translocation of water is through a process called transpiration, right? So that is the process by sucking up water, gets sucked up from the roots all the way up to the leaves and then out through the stomata. This is the transpiration is the driving force of water up the xylem to the leaves, and you get a huge amount of water vapor that is lost through this process. Just a reminder of stomata. These are on the underneath of leaves, and they're little pores that can open and close based on water movement. So when water goes into the guard cells, then they will open, and that's when you get oxygen diffusing out as waste from photosynthesis, CO2 diffusing or going in, which is really important for the carbon cycle, which are the light independent reactions that occur in the stroma. Okay, so the forces that are playing in xylem for transpiration. So one, we have transpiration, water loss through stomata, depends on temperature and humidity. We have adhesion, attraction of water molecules to different surfaces, right? So we have adhesion here, hydrogen bonding between the water molecules and the xylem cell walls. We have cohesion, attraction of water molecules to one another through hydrogen bonding. And then there's water tension, and that's really the pulling up of that in that water column. So water, again, always goes down its water potential gradient, right? From negative to more negative, right? So I like this diagram because it really shows that you can move water from the soil, which has a -3 water potential, into the root, which is -6, up the trunk to -8, in the leaves, -1, and then finally outside, which has a very, very low water potential. Water movement at the cellular level. Again, in plants, it's very important to have a central vacuole, and remember that that central vacuole provides turgidity. Water comes into that central vacuole, making the cell nice and big there. Remember, if you're in an open beaker, you have no you have no pressure potential. So remember, water potential has to do with you add in the pressure potential, only exists in plant cells, and the solute potential, which can be calculated by negative Eichert. Plants have lots of behaviors. In particular, the one that we talked about was the discovery of one plant hormone, which is all about this hormone called auxin. The experiments that proved this are up here at the top, where they can show that putting a little bit of auxin on one side of the plant can cause phototropism, or plants to grow in the direction of the light, right? So in a control cell, you have sunlight coming in, and the cells are growing towards that. The way it works for phototropism is that wherever the light is, the auxin will go to the other side and cause elongation so that the plant goes towards the light. The most likely thing on my test or on a test on the AP test is that you will be shown a set of experiments. You will be required to look at controls and experimental and controls, and try to figure out what is going on, right? So, for example, we'll talk about that then. Okay, so there's lots of other plant hormones. I just want to mention, in case that you hear of them, ethylenes for fruit ripening, cytokines for mitosis, gibberellins for fruit and root, and then the auxins for that plant elongation. You don't have to memorize these, but you might be shown experiments where they used to discover these. So in nutrition, plants are mostly composed of carbohydrates, C, H's, and O's. Where are the most carbon coming from a plant? And that is coming from carbon dioxide coming in from those stomata. That carbon dioxide gets fixed into carbohydrates. Other nutrients for plants that are important are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and there's other minor nutrients as well. Remember that plants really rely on this symbiotic relationship with fungi called mycorrhizae. This is really critical for plant growth. The mycorrhizae, the mycorrhizae really kind of infiltrate the roots and help those plants absorb.